Have you ever been so wrong about someone that it completely changed your life? Because Diego Morales was about to discover just how dangerous assumptions could be. The Miami skyline glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, but Diego Morales barely noticed the view. At 34, he commanded respect from Biscayne Bay to the Everglades, his cartel empire built on precision, loyalty, and an iron will that had never bent for anyone. The Italian leather of his chair creaked softly as he leaned back, studying the security personnel files scattered across his mahogany desk. Marcus Rivera, his second-in-command, shifted uncomfortably in the chair across from him. The scar running from Marcus's left temple to his jaw caught the lamplight as he cleared his throat. These personnel meetings always made him nervous, especially when Diego was in one of his particular moods. "I need someone invisible," Diego said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Someone who can blend into high society events, but move like a soldier when necessary." Marcus nodded, flipping through another stack of profiles. "Most of our people stand out too much in those circles, boss. The wealthy crowd, they notice things. Our guys look like what they are." Diego's fingers drummed against the desk as his mind calculated possibilities. The Delacroix Charity Gala next week would be crawling with Miami's elite, and intelligence suggested his rival Esteban Ruiz might make a move there. The venue offered too many opportunities for someone bold enough to take them. "What about international contractors?" Diego asked, though he already knew the answer would complicate things. Marcus hesitated, then slid a particular file across the desk. "There is one option, but she might not be what you're expecting." Diego's dark eyes narrowed as he opened the file. The photograph showed a woman with rich brown skin, natural hair pulled back in a professional style, and intelligent eyes that seemed to look straight through the camera. Her military record was impressive: 3 tours overseas, decorated for valor, expert marksman, hand-to-hand combat specialist. But Diego found himself focusing on details that had nothing to do with her qualifications. "She's black," he said, the words carrying an edge of dismissal he didn't bother to hide. "Her record speaks for itself," Marcus replied carefully. "Former Army Ranger, private security for 2 years since discharge. No failed assignments." Diego closed the file with more force than necessary. "You know my preferences, Marcus. I don't find black women attractive. Never have, never will. It's just not my type." The words tasted bitter even as he spoke them, though Diego couldn't understand why. He'd grown up in a world where lines were clearly drawn, where certain expectations existed about who belonged where. His grandmother had filled his childhood with stories of proper Spanish bloodlines and suitable matches. Those early lessons had shaped more than just his business philosophy. "But this isn't about attraction, boss," Marcus said, his voice gaining confidence. "This is about staying alive. Esteban's people won't expect a woman, especially not one who looks like she belongs in those circles. She could get close when our usual security can't." Diego stared at the closed file, his jaw working silently. Logic warred with a lifetime of ingrained assumptions, but logic rarely lost where his survival was concerned. The Delacroix event represented too much risk to let personal preferences cloud his judgment. "Fine," he said finally, "but make it clear this is purely professional. I don't want any complications." What Marcus didn't know, what Diego barely acknowledged to himself, was that complications had already begun the moment he'd seen that photograph. 20 miles away, Zara Williams finished her 3rd set of pull-ups in the converted garage that served as her home gym. Sweat glistened on her dark skin as she moved through her routine with the precision that had kept her alive through 3 combat tours. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was capable of. Her phone buzzed against the weight bench. Zara glanced at the number and smiled slightly. Patricia Chun, her handler at Elite Security Solutions, only called when something interesting had come up. "How do you feel about Miami high society?" Patricia asked without preamble. Zara grabbed a towel, wiping her face as she considered the question. "Depends on what you mean by high society. Are we talking boring charity dinners, or the kind where people get shot?" Patricia's laugh carried a hint of nervousness. "Potentially both. I have a client requesting you specifically. High-profile businessman, some kind of international trade. The event is a charity gala, but the pay rate suggests significant risk." Zara's interest sharpened. She'd learned to read between the lines in this business. High pay usually meant either genuine danger or clients with more money than sense. Sometimes both. What kind of businessman? She asked. The legitimate kind who owns restaurants and shipping companies, Patricia replied carefully. The kind who definitely pays his taxes and has never been investigated by any federal agencies. So the illegitimate kind, Zara translated silently. She'd worked for enough gray area clients to recognize the careful language Patricia used when describing those who operated outside normal legal boundaries. The military had taught her that the world wasn't divided into clear categories of good and evil, and private security had reinforced that lesson. Background check clean? Zara asked. Clean as it gets for someone in his position, Patricia confirmed. No violence against women, no unpaid debts, reputation for honoring contracts. His previous security worked for him for years before retiring. Zara considered this. She'd turned down clients before when her instincts warned against them, but financial necessity had a way of sharpening her risk assessment. The apartment in Coral Gables wasn't cheap, and her mother's medical bills weren't getting any smaller. Timeline. Event is next week. He wants to meet you first, assess compatibility. Standard protocol. Zara nodded, though Patricia couldn't see her. Send me the details. But Patricia, if anything feels wrong during the meet, I'm walking. Understood. I'll email everything within the hour. As Zara ended the call, she found herself wondering what kind of man needed private security for a charity event. The legitimate businessman kind, apparently. She'd learned that the most dangerous clients were often those who appeared most respectable on the surface. The Delacroix Foundation occupied a converted warehouse in Wynwood, its industrial bones softened by strategic lighting and carefully cultivated art installations. Zara arrived 15 minutes early, as was her habit, using the extra time to assess entry points and sight lines. The neighborhood had gentrified rapidly, but traces of its grittier past remained in the shadows between trendy galleries. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, charcoal gray suit that accommodated her shoulder holster, hairstyled in a way that looked professional but could be quickly secured if action became necessary. The balance between blending in and maintaining tactical readiness had become second nature. Her client had requested this meeting location specifically, claiming he wanted to see the venue in advance. Zara suspected he wanted to observe her in the environment where she'd be working, assessing how well she could navigate the intersection of high society and high stakes. The main gallery hummed with preparation for next week's gala. Caterers tested lighting, while event coordinators directed the placement of auction displays. Zara noted the multiple entrances, the elevated areas that could provide sniper positions, the flow patterns that would determine crowd movement during the actual event. Ms. Williams? Zara turned toward the voice, her training automatically cataloging details. Male, mid-30s, expensive suit tailored to accommodate what was likely a concealed weapon, confident posture that suggested familiarity with command. But it was his eyes that held her attention, dark and intelligent with an intensity that seemed to weigh everything it encountered. Diego Morales, he said, extending his hand. The moment their hands touched, something unexpected happened. Diego felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with professional assessment and everything to do with the woman standing before him. Zara was beautiful in a way that challenged every assumption he'd made about his own preferences. Her natural hair framed features that were strong and elegant simultaneously, and when she looked directly at him, Diego felt suddenly exposed in a way that was entirely unfamiliar. For her part, Zara noticed the brief flicker of surprise that crossed his features, followed immediately by what looked like confusion. She'd seen that expression before, though usually from men who'd underestimated her capabilities rather than her appearance. "Mr. Morales," she said, her handshake firm and brief. "I understand you're concerned about security for next week's event." Diego found himself struggling to maintain his usual composure. Everything about Zara Williams contradicted the dismissive comments he'd made to Marcus just days before. She moved with the fluid grace of someone supremely comfortable in her own body. Her voice carried the kind of confidence that came from proven competence, and her eyes held an intelligence that seemed to see straight through whatever facades he might construct. "That's correct," he managed, gesturing toward a quieter corner of the gallery. "Perhaps we could discuss the specifics." As they walked, Diego found himself hyper-aware of her presence beside him. The way she unconsciously scanned the room, even during casual conversation, spoke to ingrained tactical thinking. The slight adjustment of her jacket suggested she was armed and comfortable with that weight. Everything about her projected competence and strength, qualities Diego had always found attractive in theory, but never experienced in practice with such unsettling intensity. The auction preview area offered relative privacy, surrounded by glass cases displaying items that would be bid on during the gala. Zara positioned herself where she could observe both the main gallery and the side entrances, a choice Diego noticed and appreciated despite his internal turmoil. "Your file indicates extensive military experience," Diego said, falling back on professional topics to regain his equilibrium. "3 tours, special operations training." Zara nodded. Combat experience tends to provide practical skills that translate well to private security. Threat assessment, tactical planning, the ability to make decisions under pressure. "What made you leave the military?" The question was standard for this type of meeting, but something in Diego's tone suggested genuine interest rather than routine vetting. Zara considered how much to reveal, settling on the truth that didn't require extensive explanation. "My mother needed care that required me to be stateside," she said. "The military offered excellent training, but private security provides the flexibility to choose my assignments." Diego found himself wanting to ask more, to understand the person behind the professional credentials. This desire surprised him. Usually these meetings focused purely on capabilities and logistics. But something about Zara Williams made him curious about details that had nothing to do with his security needs. "The event next week," he said, forcing himself back to business, "involves significant risk. There are people who might see it as an opportunity to resolve certain business disagreements." Zara's expression didn't change, but Diego noticed the subtle shift in her posture that indicated increased attention. She wasn't intimidated by the implication of danger. If anything, she seemed more engaged. "What kind of disagreements?" she asked. "The kind that sometimes escalate beyond verbal negotiations," Diego replied carefully. "I have competitors who believe in more direct approaches to conflict resolution." "How many potential threats are we discussing?" Diego appreciated her directness. Most security contractors danced around the implications of his business, preferring plausible deniability to honest assessment. Zara seemed to understand that effective protection required complete information. "Primary concern is Esteban Ruiz," Diego said. "Colombian operation, history of eliminating competition rather than outmaneuvering it. Intelligence suggests he's planning something for the gala." Zara nodded, already shifting into tactical thinking mode. "Inside job possibility? Staff, vendors, other security? Always possible, but unlikely. The Foundation has used the same people for years, and I have ways of verifying their backgrounds. The greater risk is external assault during the event itself." "Sniper positions?" Zara asked, glancing around the gallery with professional interest. Diego followed her gaze, seeing the space through her eyes. "Multiple elevated positions in surrounding buildings," he confirmed. "Street access from 3 directions. Limited egress once the event begins. Standard protection protocol, or are you expecting to engage?" The question was delivered matter-of-factly, but Diego heard the underlying message. She was prepared for either option. "Ideally, prevention and avoidance," Diego said. "But I don't survive in my business by assuming ideal scenarios play out as planned." Something in his tone made Zara study him more carefully. She'd worked for plenty of men who operated in gray areas, but most of them either tried to impress her with their danger or downplay it entirely. Diego seemed to treat risk as a practical consideration rather than a source of either pride or anxiety. "What's your assessment of my capabilities?" she asked directly. The question caught Diego off guard, though not because it was unexpected. He'd been asking himself the same thing since she'd walked into the gallery, and the answer was becoming uncomfortably clear. Everything about Zara Williams suggested she was exactly what he needed professionally. The problem was how strongly he was responding to her personally. "Your record speaks for itself," he said finally. "Military training, successful private contracts, no failed assignments. You're clearly qualified." "But?" Zara prompted, hearing hesitation in his voice. Diego struggled with how to articulate his concern without revealing the internal conflict she'd created simply by existing. He couldn't exactly explain that his previous assumptions about attraction had been thoroughly challenged in the span of a single conversation. "No concerns about your capabilities," he said. "Only whether this particular assignment might involve more risk than your usual contracts." "I've worked in active combat zones," Zara replied. "A charity gala in Miami, even with potential complications, seems manageable by comparison." Her confidence was absolute but not arrogant, backed by experience rather than bravado. Diego found himself believing not just in her competence but in her judgment, a trust that usually took much longer to develop. "The financial arrangements are generous," Diego said, naming a figure that made Zara's eyebrows rise slightly. "The risk premium reflects the seriousness of the potential threat." "And if the threat materializes?" she asked. "Then you do whatever is necessary to keep me alive, and I ensure your compensation reflects the value of that service." Zara considered this, weighing the professional opportunity against the obvious complications. Diego Morales was clearly more than the legitimate businessman his file claimed, but he was also direct about the risks and generous with payment. More importantly, something about him suggested he was trustworthy within the bounds of their professional relationship. "When do you need an answer?" "Tomorrow," Diego said. "The event is in 4 days, which gives us minimal time for advance preparation if you accept." "I'll have Patricia call you with my decision by noon tomorrow," Zara replied. As they shook hands again, Diego felt the same jolt of awareness he'd experienced earlier. But this time, instead of confusion, he felt something closer to anticipation. Whatever had happened during this conversation, whatever assumptions had been challenged or confirmed, he found himself hoping Zara Williams would accept the assignment. For her part, Zara walked back to her car with the unsettling realization that Diego Morales had affected her in ways that had nothing to do with professional considerations. She'd worked for attractive clients before without difficulty, but something about the intensity in his dark eyes and the careful way he'd assessed her had created an awareness she usually managed to suppress entirely. As Diego watched her leave, he realized Marcus had been right about more than just Zara's tactical capabilities. She was exactly what he needed for next week's event. The problem was that she was also exactly what he'd never expected to want for reasons that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the way she'd looked at him, like she could see past every defense he'd ever constructed. The assumption that had seemed so certain just days before now felt like the most dangerous miscalculation of his life. Zara had accepted the assignment, though she'd spent most of the night questioning that decision. Something about Diego Morales had unsettled her professional equilibrium in ways she didn't want to examine too closely. But the money was too good to refuse, and her mother's latest medical bills had made the choice practical, if not entirely comfortable. The Delacroix Foundation Gala buzzed with Miami's elite, their designer gowns and tailored tuxedos creating a sea of wealth and privilege that sparkled under crystal chandeliers. Zara moved through the crowd like a shadow, her black dress elegant enough to blend with the guests while cut to accommodate her tactical needs. She'd positioned herself with clear sight lines to Diego, who worked the room with the effortless charm of someone born to command attention. He looked devastating in his custom tuxedo, she admitted reluctantly. The way the fabric molded to his shoulders suggested hours in the gym, while his easy confidence drew people to him like gravity. Zara found herself noticing details that had nothing to do with protection protocols. The way his laugh reached his eyes when genuinely amused, how his hand moved expressively when he explained something he cared about, the respectful distance he maintained with women despite his obvious appeal. "Stop it," she told herself firmly. This was exactly the kind of distraction that got people killed in her line of work. Diego Morales was a client, nothing more, regardless of how he made her pulse quicken when he looked directly at her. Through her earpiece, Marcus's voice crackled with tension. "Perimeter team reports movement on the building across the street. 3rd floor window, east side." Zara's training kicked in immediately, her hand moving unconsciously toward her concealed weapon while her eyes tracked Diego's position. He stood near the auction display, deep in conversation with a philanthropist whose foundation supported veterans programs. Too exposed, too many potential angles of attack. She moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, using the natural flow of guests to mask her approach. Diego noticed her coming. something flickering in his dark eyes that might have been appreciation for her grace under pressure. "Mr. Morales," she said quietly, positioning herself between him and the east-facing windows. "I need you to move toward the center of the room." Now, Diego's expression didn't change, but she felt him go still in the way of someone accustomed to recognizing genuine danger. "What kind of movement?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "The kind that suggests someone is lining up a shot," Zara replied, her hand settling on his elbow to guide him away from the windows. "Keep talking to your friend, act natural, but walk with me." The sophistication of her approach impressed Diego despite the circumstances. Lesser security would have caused a scene, drawn attention, created the kind of chaos that made accurate shooting easier. Zara somehow managed to relocate him while making it appear like a natural social movement. They had taken perhaps 3 steps when the world exploded. The first shot shattered the floor-to-ceiling window behind where Diego had been standing, sending guests screaming and diving for cover. Crystal glasses crashed against marble floors as people scattered in panic. But Zara was already moving, her body colliding with Diego's as she drove him toward the ground, her arms wrapping around him protectively. "Stay down," she commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos with military authority. The second shot came from a different angle, confirming Zara's worst fear: multiple shooters, coordinated attack. She rolled with Diego behind the solid marble base of a sculpture, her mind automatically calculating cover positions and escape routes. "How many?" Diego asked, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "At least 2, possibly 3, Zara replied, drawing her weapon with fluid precision. "They're trying to pin us down while the primary shooter repositions for a clean shot." Diego watched her transform from elegant party guest to lethal protector in the space of heartbeats. Every movement was purposeful, controlled, deadly efficient. The woman who had captured his attention with her beauty now commanded his respect with her competence. "Your men?" she asked. "Marcus and the team are handling the perimeter," Diego said. "But they can't get to us without exposing themselves to crossfire." Zara's mind worked through tactical possibilities with the speed that had kept her alive through 3 combat tours. The main entrance was too exposed, the service exits would be watched, but the kitchen area offered potential cover and multiple egress options. "When I say move, we go toward the kitchen," she instructed. "Stay low, stay close, do exactly what I tell you." Diego nodded, trusting her judgment completely despite having known her less than a week. Something about the absolute certainty in her voice convinced him that following her orders was his best chance of survival. "Move." They ran in a crouch, using overturned tables and fleeing guests as cover. Zara's awareness expanded to encompass every sound, every shadow, every potential threat vector. Behind them, she heard Marcus's team engaging the shooters, automatic weapons fire echoing through the gallery space. They were 15 feet from the kitchen entrance when she saw the muzzle flash from the service corridor. The third shooter, exactly where she'd expected him to be. Time slowed as her training took over completely. She could see the rifle's trajectory, calculate the bullet's path, recognize with crystal clarity that it was aimed directly at Diego's center mass. Zara threw herself sideways, slamming into Diego with enough force to drive him out of the bullet's path. The impact sent them both tumbling toward the kitchen door, but she felt the burning tear as the bullet found her left shoulder instead of his heart. The pain was immediate and fierce, but Zara's focus never wavered. Rolling to her feet despite the wound, she put 3 precise shots into the corridor where the muzzle flash had originated. The return fire ceased abruptly. "You're hit," Diego said, his voice tight with something that might have been panic. "I'm functional," Zara replied, though she could feel warm blood soaking through her dress. "We need to keep moving." But Diego was staring at the spreading crimson stain with an expression she couldn't interpret. Something had shifted in his dark eyes, an intensity that went far beyond professional concern or even personal gratitude. "You took a bullet meant for me," he said, the words carrying a weight of realization that seemed to surprise him. "It's my job," Zara replied, checking her weapon's magazine automatically. "No," Diego said quietly. "Your job is protection. What you just did was something else entirely." Before she could ask what he meant, Marcus's voice crackled through the sudden silence. "All clear, boss. Shooters are down. Paramedics are en route." The next few hours passed in a blur of police interviews, medical examinations, and damage assessment. Zara found herself in a private room at Mount Sinai Medical Center, her shoulder stitched and bandaged while nurses bustled around checking her vital signs. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major vessels, painful but not serious by combat standards. What surprised her was Diego's presence. He'd insisted on staying throughout her treatment, pacing the small room like a caged predator while doctors worked on her wound. His expensive tuxedo was rumpled and stained with her blood, but he seemed oblivious to his appearance. "You should go home," Zara said when they were finally alone. "I'm sure you have things to handle after tonight." Diego stopped pacing and looked at her directly. "What I have to handle can wait. What I need to understand is why someone with your training and background chose private security." The question was more personal than anything they discussed before, but something about the way he asked it suggested genuine interest rather than idle curiosity. Zara considered how much to reveal, settling on truth that didn't require extensive explanation. "My parents were killed in a drive-by shooting when I was 16, she said quietly. "Wrong place, wrong time, caught in someone else's gang war. I enlisted as soon as I turned 18 because I wanted to learn how to fight back against that kind of senseless violence." Diego felt something shift in his chest at her words, a recognition of shared loss that he hadn't expected. His own father had been gunned down by rivals when Diego was 22, the event that had forced him to take control of the family business earlier than anyone had planned. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it completely. "The military gave me purpose," Zara continued. "Skills, discipline, a way to turn anger into something useful. But when my mother was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's, I had to choose between my career and taking care of the only family I had left. Why private security instead of law enforcement?" Zara smiled slightly, though there was little humor in it. "Law enforcement has too many rules about who deserves protection. Private security lets me choose clients whose survival actually matters." "And I matter?" Diego asked, though he wasn't sure why her answer seemed so important. "You're not the worst person I've worked for," Zara replied, deflecting with humor rather than admitting that something about him had already begun to matter more than professional distance should allow. Diego found himself wanting to push the conversation deeper, to understand the woman who had literally taken a bullet for him just hours after accepting his contract. But before he could formulate the question, Marcus appeared in the doorway. "Boss, we need to talk," Marcus said, his expression grim. Diego looked between Marcus and Zara, torn between the immediate demands of his business and an inexplicable reluctance to leave her side. "Go," Zara said, reading his hesitation correctly. "I'll be here when you get back." The promise shouldn't have mattered as much as it did, but Diego felt something settle in his chest at her words. He followed Marcus into the corridor, though part of his attention remained focused on the woman in the hospital bed who had changed everything he thought he knew about protection, courage, and his own assumptions about attraction. The intelligence Marcus shared was sobering. Esteban Ruiz had orchestrated the attack using local contractors, but the coordination suggested more resources and better planning than previous intelligence had indicated. The assault on the gala was likely just the opening move in a larger campaign. "We need to assume he'll try again," Marcus concluded. "And next time he'll expect Ms. Williams to be protecting you." Diego considered this, his mind automatically shifting into tactical mode despite his emotional preoccupation. Esteban would adapt his strategy based on tonight's failure, which meant conventional security arrangements would be insufficient. "I want her as my primary protection," Diego said. "Boss," Marcus began carefully, "she's good, but she's one person. This kind of threat requires a full team." "She'll have a full team," Diego replied. "But I want her running point." Tonight proved she has instincts that can't be trained. What Marcus didn't say, what Diego was only beginning to acknowledge to himself, was that Zara Williams had become more than just effective security. Something about watching her put herself between him and death had fundamentally altered his perspective on what protection meant and why it mattered. When Diego returned to Zara's room, he found her sitting up despite the nurse's protests, checking her phone with the focused attention of someone accustomed to staying connected even while injured. "Your mother?" he asked, noting the concern in her expression. "The assisted living facility," Zara confirmed. "They want to discuss changes to her care plan, which usually means more money I don't have." Diego felt an unfamiliar urge to solve her problems, to use his resources to eliminate the financial stress that clearly weighed on her. But he sensed that offering money directly would offend her independence, so he approached from a different angle. "I have a proposal," he said. "After tonight, it's clear that conventional security arrangements won't be sufficient against Esteban's tactics. I need someone with your skills as my primary protection on a full-time basis." Zara studied his face, looking for the real motivation behind the offer. The money would certainly solve her immediate problems, but something in his tone suggested this went beyond practical considerations. "Full-time means living in my compound," Diego said. "24-hour proximity until the threat is neutralized. Complete integration into my security infrastructure. And when the threat is eliminated, then we renegotiate based on whatever situation exists at that point," Diego replied carefully. What he didn't say was that he couldn't imagine letting her walk away once Esteban was handled. Something about having her in his life, about knowing she was safe and protected under his roof, had become essential in ways he didn't fully understand. The compensation package Diego outlined was generous enough to ensure her mother's care for years rather than months. But more than the money, something about his offer appealed to Zara's sense of purpose. Tonight had reminded her why she'd chosen this work. The moment when training and instinct combined to save a life that mattered. "When do we start?" she asked. "Tomorrow," Diego said, relief flooding through him. "My people will handle moving your things to the compound." As Zara drifted toward sleep under the influence of pain medication, Diego found himself studying her face in the dim light of the hospital room. Everything about this woman challenged assumptions he'd held for years about attraction, competence, and what it meant to trust someone completely with his life. The bullet she'd taken for him had been intended to kill, and she'd absorbed that violence without hesitation or expectation of reward beyond her contracted fee. That kind of selfless courage was rarer than tactical skill, more valuable than any weapon in his arsenal. What Diego didn't yet realize was that in offering Zara a place in his protected world, he was opening his own carefully guarded life to the most dangerous threat he'd ever encountered. The possibility of caring more about someone else's survival than his own. Diego's compound occupied 5 acres in Coral Gables, hidden behind Mediterranean-style walls that concealed sophisticated security systems and enough firepower to repel a small army. Zara had expected opulence, but the main house surprised her with its understated elegance. Warm terracotta floors, comfortable furniture that looked lived in rather than decorative, family photographs scattered throughout rooms that felt like a home rather than a fortress. Her suite occupied the second floor's east wing, close enough to Diego's master bedroom for immediate response to threats, but far enough to maintain the illusion of professional distance. The space was larger than her entire apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking gardens where palm trees swayed in the morning breeze. Zara winced as she tried to reach the coffee maker one-handed, her left shoulder protesting any movement beyond basic function. The doctors had been optimistic about healing time, but 3 days post-surgery still left her feeling frustratingly limited. "Let me help with that." She turned to find Diego in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for business in charcoal slacks and a white shirt that emphasized the olive tone of his skin. But instead of the expensive suits she'd grown accustomed to seeing him wear, this outfit suggested casual competence rather than intimidation. "I can manage," Zara said, though her shoulders throbbing disagreed with that assessment. "I'm sure you can," Diego replied, moving past her to operate the machine with practiced efficiency. "But there's no point in aggravating the injury when help is available." His proximity filled her awareness with details she shouldn't be noticing. The subtle cologne that carried hints of cedar and citrus, the way morning light caught the silver threads beginning to appear at his temples, the careful gentleness of his movements as he prepared her coffee exactly the way she liked it. "How did you know I take it black?" she asked. "I pay attention to details," Diego said, handing her the mug with a smile that did dangerous things to her pulse. Especially when those details concern someone's survival might depend on caffeine levels. Their fingers brushed during the transfer, sending awareness crackling up Zara's arm that had nothing to do with her injured shoulder. Diego felt it too. She could see the recognition in his dark eyes before he stepped back to maintain appropriate distance. "What's the agenda today?" she asked, seeking safer conversational territory. Family dinner, Diego said, something flickering across his expression that might have been nervousness. My mother insists on meeting the woman who saved my life. Zara nearly choked on her coffee. Family dinner wasn't typically part of protection protocols, especially not with clients whose family members were presumably unaware of the dangerous realities of their loved one's business. Is that wise? She asked carefully, given the circumstances. My mother knows exactly what circumstances surround my work, Diego replied. She also knows that someone tried to kill me 3 days ago and that you prevented it from happening. In her mind, that makes you family whether you want to be or not. The concept of family had been foreign to Zara since her parents' death, reduced to her relationship with a mother who increasingly forgot her daughter's name. The idea that Diego's family might welcome her based solely on her protection of him seemed impossibly generous. What should I expect? She asked. Intense curiosity, probably some interrogation disguised as polite conversation, and enough food to feed a small country, Diego said. My mother expresses affection through cooking, and she's been preparing since yesterday. That evening, Zara found herself in Diego's formal dining room, seated across from 2 women who clearly shared his genetic heritage but possessed entirely different personalities. Isabella Morales, Diego's mother, was a petite woman in her mid-60s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. Her daughter Carmen, Diego's younger sister, carried herself with the confident elegance of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted through charm rather than force. "So you're the woman who took a bullet for my stubborn son," Isabella said without preamble, her English carrying traces of the accent she'd never quite lost despite 40 years in Miami. "It was my job, Mrs. Morales," Zara replied diplomatically. "Nonsense," Isabella said, waving her hand dismissively. "A job is something you do for money. What you did was something else entirely." Carmen leaned forward with obvious interest. "Diego says you were in the military. Special operations?" "Army Rangers," Zara confirmed. 3 tours overseas before transitioning to private security. "And now you live here, protecting our brother from people who want to hurt him," Isabella said, her tone suggesting approval rather than concern. "This is good. Diego has always been too independent for his own safety." "Mama," Diego protested, but his mother ignored him completely. "Tell me about your family, Mija," Isabella continued, using the endearment that suggested Zara had already been adopted into the clan whether she agreed or not. The question touched on territory Zara usually avoided, but something about Isabella's genuine interest made honesty seem appropriate. "My parents were killed when I was 16, she said quietly. "Gang violence, wrong place at the wrong time. I have a mother in assisted living, but Alzheimer's means she doesn't really know me anymore." Isabella's expression softened with maternal sympathy. "Ay, Mija, I'm so sorry. But you see, this is why family is so important. We choose who belongs to us, not just who shares our blood." Diego watched the interaction with growing amazement. His mother had always been protective of the family's inner circle, suspicious of outsiders who might exploit their position or wealth. But she was treating Zara with the warmth usually reserved for lifelong friends or relatives by marriage. What impressed him even more was Zara's response. The professional guard she maintained with everyone else seemed to lower slightly in his mother's presence, revealing glimpses of the woman behind the warrior facade. After dinner, Diego showed Zara through parts of the compound she hadn't yet seen, including the legitimate businesses that funded his public lifestyle. The shipping company occupied a modern office building in downtown Miami, its operations employing nearly 200 people in genuinely legal activities. "Not everything I do requires hiding in shadows," Diego explained as they walked through empty corridors lined with family photographs and employee recognition awards. "My grandfather started this company with a single truck and determination to build something lasting." "What changed?" Zara asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Competition that didn't respect legal boundaries," Diego said. "Suppliers who demanded protection money, union leaders who worked for rival organizations, government officials whose cooperation required unofficial incentives. The choice became adapt to those realities or watch everything my family built disappear." Zara nodded, understanding the impossible decisions that shaped lives in ways outsiders couldn't appreciate. The military had taught her that survival sometimes required compromising ideals, though the stakes had been measured in lives rather than profits. They were returning to the main house when Marcus approached with an expression that immediately put both of them on alert. "We have a problem," Marcus said. "Intelligence indicates Esteban is shifting strategy. Instead of targeting you directly, he's planning to go after your family." Diego went very still in the way that Zara had learned meant he was processing threat calculations. "Which family members?" he asked. "Carmen, primarily," Marcus replied. "She's most accessible, most likely to create emotional leverage. Her apartment building has minimal security, and she maintains predictable routines. Move her here," Diego said immediately. "Tonight." "She won't want to come," Marcus warned. "You know how your sister feels about being protected." "She doesn't get a choice," Diego replied, his voice carrying the authority that had built his empire. Esteban crossed a line when he decided to involve people who aren't part of this business. Zara watched Diego transform from the thoughtful host who'd shown her, through his legitimate operations, into the cartel leader whose word was law within his organization. The shift was seamless but absolute, reminding her that the man who brought her coffee and worried about her injured shoulder was also someone capable of decisive violence when circumstances required it. "I'll handle Carmen," Zara said quietly. Woman to woman, she might accept protection more easily if it doesn't come as an order from her brother. Diego looked at her with something that might have been gratitude mixed with relief. "You think she'll listen to you?" "She'll listen to someone who understands what it means to lose family to violence," Zara replied. "And someone who can explain exactly what Esteban is capable of without sugarcoating the reality." An hour later, they stood in Carmen's penthouse apartment while she paced furiously around her living room, alternately cursing her brother's overprotectiveness and Esteban's existence in 3 languages. "This is ridiculous," Carmen said for the 4th time. "I'm not going to hide in Diego's compound like some helpless princess while he handles his business problems." "This isn't about being helpless," Zara said calmly. "This is about recognizing that Esteban views you as a weapon to use against your brother. Every moment you spend unprotected is another opportunity for him to hurt Diego by hurting you." Carmen stopped pacing and stared at Zara directly. "You really think he'd go that far?" "I think a man who orchestrates assassination attempts at charity events doesn't have moral boundaries about targeting family members," Zara replied. "And I think your brother would never forgive himself if something happened to you, because he failed to take reasonable precautions." The appeal to Carmen's concern for Diego's emotional well-being proved more effective than arguments about her own safety. Within 2 hours, she was installed in the compound's guest wing with enough luggage to suggest an extended stay. Later that night, Zara found Diego on the covered terrace overlooking the gardens, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand as he stared into the darkness beyond the compound's walls. "Second-guessing the decision to bring Carmen here?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. "Second-guessing every decision that led to her being in danger," Diego replied. "When I took over the family business, I promised myself I'd keep the violence away from the people I love. Apparently, I'm better at making promises than keeping them." The self-recrimination in his voice surprised Zara. She'd seen Diego command respect through force and intelligence, but this glimpse of vulnerability revealed depths she hadn't expected. "You can't control other people's choices," she said quietly. "Esteban decided to make this personal. That's on him, not you." "Is it?" Diego asked, finally looking at her directly. "Every enemy I've made, every line I've crossed, every decision that prioritized power over principle, it all created the circumstances that put Carmen at risk." Zara considered her response carefully, recognizing that Diego was sharing guilt he probably didn't reveal to anyone else. The trust implicit in that openness deserved honesty rather than platitudes. "The world you inherited wasn't clean," she said finally. "Your father's death forced you to choose between taking control or watching everything your family built disappear. You've protected more people than you've endangered, employed more families than you've threatened. That has to count for something." Diego felt something ease in his chest at her words. Not absolution, but understanding from someone whose judgment he'd learned to respect completely. "How do you do it?" he asked. "Carry the weight of protecting people without letting it consume you?" "You remember that the alternative is worse," Zara replied. "And you find people worth protecting who remind you why the weight is necessary." Their eyes met across the small space between their chairs, and suddenly the air seemed charged with awareness that had been building since that first meeting at the gallery. Diego felt drawn to her in ways that challenged every assumption he'd made about attraction, while Zara found herself leaning slightly forward despite every professional instinct warning against personal involvement. "Zara," Diego began, his voice rough with something that might have been longing. The moment was shattered by Marcus's voice from the house. "Boss, we've got movement on the perimeter. 3 vehicles, unidentified." The spell broke immediately as both of them shifted into tactical mode. Whatever had been building between them would have to wait while they focused on the immediate threat of keeping his family alive through another night. But as they moved toward the house to coordinate the compound's defenses, Diego found himself thinking that the most dangerous threat to his carefully controlled world wasn't Esteban Ruiz or his cartel rivals. It was the woman beside him who had somehow become essential to his survival in ways that went far beyond professional protection. The call came at 3 in the morning, Marcus's voice tight with controlled panic over the encrypted line. "They have Carmen," he said without preamble. "Grabbed her leaving the gallery opening downtown. Professional job, no witnesses, no surveillance footage." Diego was awake and moving before Marcus finished speaking, adrenaline flooding his system with the kind of focused clarity that had kept him alive for over a decade in this business. Beside him, Zara emerged from her room already dressed in tactical gear, her injured shoulder strapped and her expression grim with determination. "How long ago?" Diego asked, pulling on body armor with practiced efficiency. 20 minutes, Marcus replied. "They left a phone with Carmen's purse. Esteban wants to negotiate." Diego felt something cold and lethal settle in his chest. Esteban had crossed the final line by targeting family, which meant the rules had fundamentally changed. This was no longer about business territory or profit margins. This was about survival and the people Diego would kill to protect. "What are his demands?" Zara asked, checking her weapon with the methodical precision that indicated complete tactical focus. "Exchange himself for Carmen," Marcus said. "Meet at the old warehouse district. Come alone, unarmed." "Standard trap," Zara said immediately. "He has no intention of letting either of them live." Diego nodded, his mind already working through tactical possibilities. Esteban's mistake was assuming Diego operated under conventional limitations when family was threatened. The cartel king who attended charity galas and donated to veterans programs was about to remind Miami's underworld why his name carried fear as well as respect. "We go in together," Diego said. "Full tactical approach, multiple entry points, overwhelming force." "Your shoulder," Diego began, but Zara cut him off with a look that could have stopped bullets. "My shoulder is functional, and Carmen is family," she said. "You're not doing this without backup you can trust completely." The warehouse district sprawled across 20 acres of industrial decay, abandoned buildings providing countless positions for snipers and ambush points. Intelligence suggested Esteban had chosen the location specifically for its tactical advantages, confident that Diego's emotional investment in his sister would override strategic thinking. What Esteban hadn't anticipated was facing Diego Morales working in partnership with someone whose military training had been forged in environments far more hostile than Miami's criminal underworld. Zara studied the satellite imagery with professional assessment, identifying sight lines, escape routes, and the most likely positions for hostile forces. Her shoulder ached with each movement, but adrenaline and purpose had temporarily overridden the pain. "Main building, center of the complex," Diego said, pointing to the largest structure. "If I were setting a trap, that's where I'd position the primary force." "Agreed," Zara replied. "But Carmen won't be there. Too exposed, too much risk of collateral damage during an assault. She'll be in a secondary location, somewhere they can eliminate her quickly if the situation deteriorates." "The smaller building to the east," Diego said, following her tactical reasoning. "Single story, multiple exits, defensible, but not a fortress." "We split up," Zara suggested. "You create a distraction at the main building, draw their attention, while I extract Carmen from the secondary location." "No," Diego said immediately. "We stay together, extract Carmen together, leave together." Something in his voice made Zara look at him more closely. She recognized the expression from military commanders who'd lost soldiers under their watch, the fear that delegating responsibility would result in irreplaceable loss. Diego, she said quietly. I know what I'm doing. So do I, he replied. And what I'm doing is making sure I don't lose both of you tonight. The admission hung between them, laden with implications neither had time to examine. But Zara felt something shift in her chest at his words, a recognition that somewhere during their forced proximity, Diego had become more than a client she was contracted to protect. Modified plan, she said. We approach together, assess the situation, adapt based on what we find. But if splitting up becomes tactically necessary, you let me do my job. Diego nodded, though every instinct screamed against allowing Zara anywhere near the kind of violence that was about to unfold. But he'd seen her competence firsthand, and Carmen's survival might depend on utilizing all available assets. The assault began at 4:30, using the pre-dawn darkness to mask their approach. Diego's team created diversions at multiple points throughout the complex while he and Zara moved toward the smaller building where intelligence suggested Carmen was being held. They moved like dancers who'd rehearsed the same routine for years, despite having worked together for less than a week. Zara's military training complemented Diego's street-learned tactics, creating a partnership that felt both natural and devastatingly effective. Two guards at the east entrance, Zara whispered, her voice barely audible through their comm system. Eliminate them quietly, Diego replied, and they moved in perfect coordination. The guards never had a chance to raise an alarm. Diego's years of experience in close-quarters violence combined with Zara's military precision resulted in swift, silent, and completely lethal efficiency. Inside the warehouse, they found Carmen tied to a chair in what had once been an office space. Her face bruised, but her eyes blazing with the kind of fury that ran in the Morales family bloodline. She looked up as they entered, relief flooding her expression. About time, she said, as if rescue by her brother and his bodyguard had been inevitable rather than uncertain. Are you injured? Zara asked, cutting Carmen's restraints with tactical efficiency. Nothing serious, Carmen replied. But there are at least 6 men in the main building, and they have enough firepower to level half the district. Diego felt the familiar cold calculation settle over him as he processed this information. Esteban had planned for a war, which meant they needed to end this definitively rather than simply escaping with Carmen. Change of plans, he said. We don't just extract and run. We finish this tonight. Zara understood immediately. Leaving Esteban operational meant living under constant threat, meant his family would never be safe, meant looking over their shoulders for the rest of their lives. Better to resolve the situation permanently while they held tactical advantage. The final assault was brutal and brief. Diego's team coordinated with precision born of long practice, while Zara provided covering fire that allowed them to systematically neutralize Esteban's forces. When it was over, 6 men were dead and Esteban Ruiz was bleeding out in the warehouse office where he'd planned to murder Carmen. It's finished, Diego said, standing over his rival's body with satisfaction that was cold and complete. The ride back to the compound passed in relative silence, adrenaline gradually fading to leave them all exhausted and emotionally drained. Carmen dozed in the back seat while Diego drove with steady concentration, but Zara found herself watching his profile with growing awareness of how dramatically the night had changed everything between them. They had functioned as genuine partners during the rescue, trusting each other completely in life-or-death situations. The professional distance she'd maintained since accepting his contract had evaporated entirely during those moments when Carmen's survival depended on their coordination. At the compound, Diego walked his sister to the guest wing while Zara secured the weapons and conducted a perimeter check with automatic thoroughness. But when she returned to the main house, she found Diego waiting in the kitchen with 2 glasses of whiskey and an expression that suggested he needed to talk through what had happened. She's safe, Zara said, accepting the glass he offered. Because of you, Diego replied. If you hadn't been there tonight, I would have lost her. We were there together, Zara corrected. Your tactical knowledge, your team, your resources. This was a partnership, not a rescue operation. Diego studied her face in the soft kitchen lighting, seeing details that had nothing to do with professional assessment. The way exhaustion brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes, how adrenaline had left her skin slightly flushed, the unconscious grace with which she moved even when bone-deep tired. I need to tell you something, he said quietly. Zara felt her pulse quicken at something in his tone, an intensity that went far beyond post-mission analysis. My father was killed when I was 22, Diego continued. Rival cartel, territorial dispute, the kind of violence that comes with this business. I had a choice. Take over the family operations or watch everything he built disappear. Why are you telling me this? Zara asked, though she suspected the answer had everything to do with the way he was looking at her. Because I've spent 12 years convincing myself that the violence was necessary, that protecting the family business justified every decision I made. But tonight, watching you risk your life to save my sister, I realized I've been lying to myself about what actually matters. Diego stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion and something deeper in his dark eyes. What matters is this, he said. You matter. What we did tonight, how we worked together, the way you've become essential to my life in just 1 week. I can't pretend this is just about professional protection anymore. Zara felt her breath catch at his words, at the raw honesty in his voice. Everything she'd been trying to ignore about her growing feelings crystallized into undeniable truth. She was falling for Diego Morales in ways that terrified and thrilled her simultaneously. Diego, she began, but he reached out to cup her face gently, his thumb stroking across her cheek. Tell me you feel it too, he said quietly. Tell me this isn't just in my head. Instead of answering with words, Zara rose on her toes and kissed him. The contact was electric, desperate, full of all the emotion and adrenaline and fear they'd carried through the night. Diego's arms came around her immediately, pulling her closer as if he could keep her safe through proximity alone. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Zara saw her own wonder reflected in Diego's eyes. This complicates everything, she said quietly. I know, Diego replied, but I don't care anymore. They made love with the desperate intensity of people who'd faced death together and emerged transformed. Diego was achingly gentle with her injured shoulder, but everywhere else he touched her with reverent possession that made her feel precious and desired beyond anything she'd ever experienced. Afterward, lying in Diego's bed with dawn light filtering through the windows, Zara traced patterns on his chest while he played with her hair. The intimacy felt both foreign and absolutely right, as if this was what had been missing from her carefully controlled life. What happens now? She asked quietly. Now we figure out how to build something real together, Diego said. However long it takes, whatever obstacles we face, we figure it out. Zara wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that love could bridge the gap between their different worlds. But as morning light revealed the reality of their situation, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest battles were still ahead of them. The week following Esteban's death should have brought peace, but Diego had learned long ago that power vacuums in his world were filled quickly and usually violently. The intelligence Marcus brought him 3 days later confirmed his worst fears about the consequences of eliminating his rival. Alejandro Vasquez is moving to absorb Esteban's territory, Marcus said, spreading reconnaissance photos across Diego's desk. He's claiming that you overstepped by executing Esteban without cartel approval, that it was an unauthorized kill that violated traditional protocols. Diego studied the photographs with growing concern. Vasquez commanded significantly more resources than Esteban ever had, with connections to cartels in Colombia, Mexico, and several Central American countries. Where Esteban had been a local threat, Vasquez represented something far more dangerous, a coordinated international response. How much support does he have? Diego asked, though he suspected the answer would complicate everything. Enough to make this a real problem, Marcus replied grimly. The other families are staying neutral for now, but if Vasquez demonstrates strength early, they might decide backing him is safer than supporting us. From her position near the window, Zara watched Diego process this information with the cold calculation she'd learned to respect and fear simultaneously. In the weeks since they'd become lovers, she discovered that the man who brought her morning coffee and made love to her with devastating tenderness could shift into lethal tactical thinking without missing a beat. What's his timeline? Zara asked, her military training automatically seeking critical intelligence. Intelligence suggests he's planning something major for this weekend, Marcus said. Multiple targets hit simultaneously, designed to demonstrate that Diego's organization is vulnerable despite eliminating Esteban. Diego felt familiar ice settle in his chest as he recognized the scope of the threat. Vasquez wasn't just seeking to expand territory. He was launching a systematic campaign to destroy everything Diego had spent 12 years building. Which targets? Diego asked. The shipping company, the restaurants, probably the compound, Marcus replied. He wants to hit both your legitimate businesses and your personal life. Maximum impact, minimum escape routes. Zara moved away from the window, her expression shifting into the tactical focus Diego had learned to associate with imminent violence. Can we relocate your family? Get them somewhere completely secure? My mother won't leave Miami, Diego said. She's lived in the same house for 40 years, raised her children there. And Carmen has her gallery opening next week, an event she's planned for months. Then we defend in place, Zara said. Fortify the positions that matter most, coordinate with law enforcement where possible, eliminate threats before they can establish operational superiority. Diego looked at her with something that might have been pride mixed with terror. Everything about Zara's approach was tactically sound, but it also meant placing the woman he loved directly in the path of significant danger. There's another option, Diego said quietly. Zara recognized the tone immediately, the careful neutrality that meant Diego was about to suggest something she wouldn't like. I could walk away, Diego continued. Sell the legitimate businesses to Vasquez at fair market value. Liquidate the cartel assets. Relocate somewhere he doesn't have influence. Remove myself as a target entirely. The suggestion hit Zara like a physical blow. Everything about Diego Morales that had attracted her, that had made her fall in love with him, was tied to his strength and his refusal to surrender in the face of threats. The idea of him abandoning the empire he'd built, the people who depended on him, felt like watching him diminish himself voluntarily. You can't be serious, she said. I'm completely serious, Diego replied. Vasquez wants me specifically. If I'm gone, he has no reason to target my family, my employees, the hundreds of people whose livelihoods depend on my businesses. And what about your responsibilities? Zara asked, her voice sharpening with something that might have been anger. What about the legitimate employees who've worked for you for years? What about maintaining stability in a region that will descend into chaos if you create a power vacuum? Those responsibilities have already cost too much, Diego said. My father died for this business. Esteban targeted Carmen because of what I represent. Now Vasquez is threatening everyone I care about, including you. The admission hung between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond tactical considerations. Diego was offering to sacrifice everything he'd built to keep her safe, and the gesture was simultaneously the most romantic and most infuriating thing Zara had ever experienced. I didn't fall in love with someone who runs away, she said quietly. I fell in love with Diego Morales, the man who protects what matters regardless of the cost. Even if the cost is your life? Diego asked. Especially if the cost is my life, Zara replied. Because that's what love means. We face threats together, we protect what we've built together, we don't let fear make us smaller than we really are. Diego felt something break open in his chest at her words. In a world where loyalty was usually purchased and alliances shifted based on profit calculations, Zara was offering something he'd never expected to find. Someone willing to fight beside him not because she was paid to, but because she chose to. The attack came 36 hours later, coordinated across multiple fronts with the kind of precision that confirmed Vasquez's international resources. Diego found himself defending the shipping company offices while Zara led the compound's defense. Their forces split, but connected through constant communication. Zara, Diego's voice crackled through her earpiece as she directed fire teams from the compound's central command post. Status report. Perimeter secure, Zara replied, though explosions from the main gate suggested that security was temporary. They're probing our defenses, looking for weak points. How are you managing downtown? Under control, but barely, Diego said, and she could hear gunfire in the background. Vasquez brought more people than intelligence suggested. The admission sent ice through Zara's veins. If Diego was outnumbered at the shipping company, if his position became untenable, she might lose him before they'd had the chance to build the life they'd promised each other just days before. Fall back to the secondary position, she said. Don't try to hold ground that isn't defensible. Negative, Diego replied. If I lose the shipping company, Vasquez gains legitimacy with the other families. I hold this position or we lose everything. Zara understood the strategic importance of his decision, but strategy felt irrelevant when weighed against the possibility of losing the man she loved to stubborn pride. Diego, she said, abandoning tactical communication for raw honesty. I need you to come home to me tonight. Whatever it costs, whatever we lose, I need you alive. The words hung in the static-filled silence, both of them acknowledging that survival was no longer about business considerations or strategic thinking. It was about love and the future they wanted to build together, and the recognition that nothing else mattered if they didn't both live through the next few hours. I'm coming home, Diego said, and she heard something shift in his voice. All units, prepare for tactical withdrawal to fallback positions. The battle lasted until dawn, a brutal test of coordination and firepower that left both sides bloodied, but neither decisively defeated. When the immediate threat finally receded, Diego and Zara found themselves in his study, exhausted and adrenaline crashed, but alive. Vasquez retreated, but he'll be back, Diego said, accepting the whiskey Zara handed him. This was just the opening move. Then we'll be ready for the next one, Zara replied. Together. Diego looked at her with wonder that hadn't diminished despite everything they'd survived. A week ago, he'd been convinced that black women weren't his type, that attraction followed predictable patterns he understood completely. Now he couldn't imagine his life without the woman who'd challenged every assumption he'd ever made about love, loyalty, and what it meant to find someone worth fighting beside. I love you, he said, the words carrying weight they'd never held before. I love you too, Zara replied. Which is why we're going to end this threat permanently, build something lasting together, and prove that love doesn't make us weaker. That night, they made love with desperate intensity, both acknowledging that tomorrow might bring final confrontation with Vasquez. But instead of fear, Zara felt anticipation. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, as partners who'd chosen each other despite every obstacle. The man who'd once dismissed her based on prejudice now trusted her completely with his life, his family, and his future. And she'd found in him the kind of strength and devotion she'd never expected to inspire in anyone. Tomorrow would bring whatever challenges Vasquez could devise, but tonight belonged to them. The final confrontation came 2 weeks later at the port of Miami, where Vasquez had arranged what he claimed was a peace summit, but Diego recognized as an elaborate trap. The shipping containers provided countless hiding spots for snipers, while the isolated location ensured no interference from law enforcement or civilian witnesses. Diego stood on the designated dock with Zara at his side, both of them wearing body armor beneath formal business attire that maintained the pretense of legitimate negotiation. Around them, 30 of his most trusted men had positioned themselves with military precision, while intelligence suggested Vasquez had brought twice that number. The odds were not encouraging, but Diego had learned that survival in his business often came down to who was willing to risk everything when stakes became absolute. Vasquez approached with the confident swagger of someone who believed victory was inevitable. He was younger than Diego by nearly a decade, his expensive suit unable to disguise the prison tattoos that marked his rise through Colombia's most violent cartels. Diego Morales, Vasquez called out in accented English. The man who thinks he can kill cartel royalty without consequences. Esteban wasn't royalty, Diego replied calmly. He was a local dealer who forgot his place and threatened my family. Your family, Vasquez repeated, his gaze sliding to Zara with obvious contempt. Is this the black woman who's made you forget your heritage? Your grandfather must be spinning in his grave. Diego felt fury rise in his chest at the insult, but Zara's subtle touch on his arm kept him focused on tactics rather than emotion. She was right to urge restraint. Vasquez was trying to provoke a reaction that would justify the slaughter he'd planned. My heritage includes respecting strength wherever I find it, Diego said. Something you might understand if you'd earned your position instead of inheriting it. The barb struck home. Vasquez's expression darkened as he signaled his men to tighten their positions around the negotiation area. You have a choice, Vasquez said. Surrender your territory voluntarily and live in exile, or watch everyone you care about die slowly. Diego was about to respond when Zara's hand tightened on his arm. She'd spotted the sniper positioning himself behind a shipping container 40 yards away, his rifle trained not on Diego, but on her. The realization hit them simultaneously. Vasquez intended to eliminate Zara first, knowing her death would destroy Diego's tactical thinking and leave him vulnerable to capture rather than clean execution. "Move," Zara said quietly, but Diego had already recognized the threat. The shot came from multiple directions at once, a coordinated assault designed to eliminate both primary targets simultaneously. But Zara's military training had anticipated the tactical setup, and she moved with desperate precision to intercept the bullet meant for Diego's heart. The impact drove her backward into his arms, blood spreading across her tactical vest as Diego caught her falling body. The bullet had found the gap between armor plates, and this time the wound was serious in ways that made his world narrow to her labored breathing and the spreading crimson stain. "Stay with me," Diego commanded, his voice rough with terror he'd never experienced before. Around them, the port erupted in gunfire as his men engaged Vasquez's forces with lethal efficiency. But Diego's entire universe had contracted to the woman bleeding in his arms, the woman who'd taken a second bullet meant for him, without hesitation or expectation of reward. Zara's eyes found his, still clear despite the pain. "Finish this," she said, her voice barely audible above the chaos. "Don't let him win." The words released something primal in Diego, something beyond tactical thinking or strategic consideration. Vasquez had targeted the woman Diego loved, had tried to take from him the only person who'd ever made him want to be better than the violence that had shaped his life. What happened next was brutal and decisive. Diego moved through Vasquez's forces like a force of nature, his fury focused into lethal precision that left bodies scattered across the dock. When he reached Vasquez himself, there was no negotiation or mercy, only the kind of definitive justice that ended threats permanently. The ambulance ride to Mount Sinai felt endless, Zara's hand growing cold in his while paramedics worked to stabilize her condition. Diego found himself making bargains with a god he'd stopped believing in years ago, promising anything in exchange for her survival. She'd become everything to him in a way that defied logic or expectation. The woman who'd challenged his prejudices, who'd proven that attraction and love followed no predictable patterns, who'd shown him that strength came in forms he'd never anticipated. The surgery lasted 4 hours, for hours during which Diego paced the hospital corridors like a caged predator while his mother and Carmen kept vigil beside him. When the surgeon finally emerged with cautiously optimistic news, Diego felt something break open in his chest that might have been relief or gratitude or pure love. "She'll need months to fully recover," the surgeon explained, "but there's no permanent damage. She's extraordinarily lucky and remarkably strong." Diego didn't feel lucky. He felt humbled by the realization that Zara had risked everything for him twice now, had literally taken bullets meant to end his life. The debt he owed her went far beyond money or protection or any conventional form of repayment. When Zara finally woke 3 days later, the first thing she saw was Diego asleep in the chair beside her bed, his hand holding hers while exhaustion made him look younger and more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. "Hey," she said quietly, and his eyes opened immediately. "Hey yourself," Diego replied, relief flooding his voice. "How do you feel?" "Like I got shot," Zara said, managing a weak smile. "But alive, which is better than the alternative." Diego leaned forward, his expression serious in ways that made her pulse quicken despite the pain medication flowing through her system. "Marry me," he said without preamble. The proposal wasn't romantic or carefully planned, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty that left no room for doubt about his intentions. Zara stared at him, searching his face for any sign that trauma or guilt was influencing his judgment. What she saw was the man she'd fallen in love with, asking her to build a life together with the same decisive confidence he brought to everything that mattered. "Yes," she said simply, and watched wonder transform his features. The engagement ring he presented 2 weeks later was an emerald surrounded by diamonds, chosen because the green reminded him of her tactical gear and the strength she'd shown protecting him. It was unconventional and perfect, exactly like everything else about their relationship. 6 months later, Zara stood in the offices of Morales Security Solutions, the legitimate company they'd built together using their combined expertise in protection and risk assessment. The business had grown faster than either had anticipated, with clients ranging from Fortune 500 executives to foreign diplomats who needed the kind of comprehensive security only former military and reformed cartel leaders could provide. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see Diego conducting a training session with their newest recruits, his movements still carrying the lethal grace that had first attracted her attention. But now that dangerous competence was directed toward protecting rather than conquering, building rather than destroying. Her left hand moved unconsciously to her still flat stomach, where their first child was growing with the same determined strength that seemed to characterize everything in their lives together. They'd decided to wait until after the wedding to share the news, but the knowledge filled her with anticipation for the family they were creating. The man who'd once claimed black women weren't his type now spent his evenings planning a future with the black woman who'd become his everything. He'd traded cartel leadership for legitimate business partnership, violence for protection, isolation for love that challenged every assumption he'd ever made about what he wanted from life. Their wedding was scheduled for next month, a celebration that would unite their chosen family with the traditions they'd built together. Isabella had insisted on planning everything, treating Zara's integration into the Morales clan as the most natural thing in the world. Diego appeared in the doorway, his expression softening as it always did when he looked at her. "How are you feeling?" he asked, concern evident despite her insistence that pregnancy was a normal condition rather than a medical emergency. "Perfect," Zara replied, moving into his arms with the ease of someone who'd found exactly where she belonged. As Diego held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest, he marveled at how wrong he'd been about everything that mattered. Love hadn't followed the patterns he'd expected or the prejudices he'd inherited. Instead, it had arrived in the form of a woman whose strength complemented his own, whose courage had literally saved his life, whose love had transformed him into someone worthy of the future they were building together. Have you ever discovered that your deepest assumptions about love were completely wrong? Because sometimes the most beautiful relationships come from the most unexpected places, proving that the heart recognizes what the mind hasn't learned to see yet. True love doesn't follow rules or prejudices or carefully constructed preferences. It simply is, powerful and transformative, and absolutely worth every risk required to protect it. Their story had begun with his dismissive comment about never finding black women attractive, but it had become something far more profound. Proof that love could bridge any gap, heal any wound, and transform any heart willing to let go of limiting beliefs in favor of unlimited possibility.